My father had been dead for exactly 43 minutes when the lawyer looked up from the will, stared directly at me, and said, "There's one condition no one in this room is expecting." The room went silent, not the respectful silence that follows a funeral. Not the awkward silence of grieving relatives avoiding eye contact. This was something colder. Every head turned toward me at once. My older brother Daniel slowly lowered his coffee cup without taking his eyes off my face. My stepmother Linda stopped crying so abruptly it was almost theatrical. Even my father's lifelong attorney, Richard Caldwell, seemed uncomfortable holding the thick envelope in his hands. I hadn't said a single word, but somehow, in that moment, everyone acted as if I'd already done something unforgivable, and I had absolutely no idea why. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 34 years old, divorced, and work as a paramedic outside Columbus, Ohio. People like to think paramedics become emotionally numb after years of responding to accidents, overdoses, and heart attacks. They're wrong. You don't stop feeling. You simply learn how to keep breathing while your heart quietly falls apart. When my father collapsed from a massive stroke 3 days earlier, I was the one who performed CPR until the ambulance arrived. I knew before the doctors told us. His eyes never focused on me again. He was gone long before the machines admitted it. That should have been the hardest moment of my life. It wasn't, not even close. Dad had never been an easy man to love. Thomas Carter built one of the largest commercial construction companies in central Ohio from nothing. He admired discipline more than affection. Mistakes weren't discussed. They were remembered. Compliments were so rare that my brother and I could still remember every single one we'd ever received. Daniel got most of them. He'd followed Dad into the family business immediately after college. Perfect grades, perfect marriage, perfect suits. If our father had built a son from blueprints, he would have built Daniel. I was different. I chose emergency medicine instead of business. Dad called it running toward other people's disasters instead of building something worthwhile. After that conversation, we barely spoke for almost 2 years. Only my mother kept the family together. When cancer took her 12 years ago, something disappeared inside all of us. Dad buried himself in work. Daniel buried himself in ambition. I buried myself in 12-hour shifts. No one ever really healed. We just became experts at pretending. But pretending has an expiration date. I just didn't know ours would arrive inside a lawyer's office. The funeral itself had been exactly what Dad would have wanted. Short, formal, efficient, more business partners than friends, more handshakes than hugs. Hundreds of people came to honor the empire he'd built. Very few came to remember the man behind it. That bothered me more than I expected, because underneath all the impossible expectations, he was still my father, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who drove 6 hours through a snowstorm to rescue me after my first car broke down in college, who secretly paid off my student loans without ever admitting he'd done it. Love was never his language. Actions were, sometimes. After the cemetery, only immediate family followed Richard Caldwell to his office for the reading of the will. Daniel arrived first. His wife, Melissa, sat beside him, whispering something that made him nod almost mechanically. Linda entered 5 minutes later, wearing oversized sunglasses despite being indoors. She'd married Dad 6 years after Mom died. No one in the family had ever completely accepted her. Not because she'd done anything terrible, because she'd arrived too soon. Or at least that's what grief convinced us. She smiled too much, decorated the house differently, suggested vacations Dad had never wanted before. Every change felt like another brick covering my mother's memory. Maybe we judged her unfairly, maybe not. Even now, I honestly couldn't tell. Richard waited until everyone sat down before locking the office door. "I know this is difficult," he said quietly. "Thomas updated his will 4 months ago." Daniel looked surprised. "So recently?" Richard nodded. "Personally, something shifted in the room. Dad hadn't mentioned changing anything. Not to any of us. Why keep it secret? Unless someone had given him a reason?" The attorney opened the folder. His voice became strangely formal. "To my wife, Linda Carter, I leave our home, all jointly owned assets, and a lifetime income from the family trust." Linda inhaled sharply. Not relief, calculation. It lasted less than a second, but I noticed. Years working emergency calls teach you to notice expressions people wish they'd hidden. Daniel noticed too. Our eyes met briefly. Neither of us spoke. Richard continued. Richard, to my eldest son, Daniel Carter, I leave 35% ownership of Carter Construction Incorporated. Daniel nodded once, exactly what everyone expected. He'd practically been running the company already. The transition made perfect sense. No surprises. Until Richard stopped reading. He adjusted his glasses twice, then looked directly at me. I suddenly realized everyone else had noticed the pause as well. What is it? Daniel finally asked. Richard hesitated, something I had never seen him do before. There is an additional clause. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. To my younger son, Ethan Carter. Richard cleared his throat. I leave my remaining ownership in Carter Construction. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Linda blinked. Daniel actually laughed. A short, confused laugh. What? Richard continued, representing 51% controlling interest. The words echoed inside the room. 51%. Control, not money, power. Daniel slowly stood. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. My father promised me the company. I'm reading exactly what he signed. Melissa grabbed Daniel's arm. He shook her off. Linda's face had gone completely pale. Thomas would never do this. I assure you, Richard answered calmly. He did. I couldn't speak. I didn't even want the company. I hadn't attended a board meeting in nearly 10 years. I couldn't name half the executives. This made absolutely no sense. Then Richard turned another page. I haven't finished. Everyone froze again. There is one condition attached to Ethan's inheritance. Daniel folded his arms. Of course there is. Richard looked directly into my eyes. If Ethan refuses this condition, his entire inheritance is to be destroyed. Destroyed? Not transferred. Not donated. Destroyed. Even Richard sounded disturbed saying it aloud. What condition? I finally managed. The attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed a second sealed envelope from inside the folder. Across the front, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words. Only Ethan may read this alone. The room exploded. Daniel slammed both hands onto the table. Absolutely not. Linda stood up so quickly her chair tipped backward. What is he hiding? Melissa whispered. This isn't normal. Richard raised one hand. It gets even more unusual. He reached into the envelope one final time. There is a handwritten instruction from Thomas. He looked at every person in the room before reading it aloud. No one leaves this office until Ethan decides whether he accepts my condition. For the first time that afternoon, I noticed something I'd completely missed before. Daniel wasn't angry about losing money. He looked terrified. And somehow, that frightened me even more. No one spoke. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in my hands, though it weighed almost nothing. The thick cream paper carried my father's unmistakable handwriting. Every letter was firm, deliberate, exactly the way he'd signed contracts worth millions of dollars. I could almost hear his voice. Only Ethan may read this alone. Daniel stepped toward me. No. It was the first word he'd spoken without shouting. You don't open that. I stared at him. Why? His jaw tightened. Because whatever game Dad is playing, it's already tearing this family apart. It sounded reasonable, almost convincing, but there was something hidden beneath his calm voice. Fear. Not anger, fear. The distinction mattered. Richard Caldwell slowly stood from his chair. Thomas was very specific. Ethan must read the letter privately. Linda crossed her arms. Private? Since when do wills have secret instructions? They usually don't, Richard admitted. This is highly unusual. Then ignore it, Daniel snapped. Richard looked almost offended. I represented your father for 38 years. I will not violate his final wishes. The room grew tense again. Every second felt longer than the last. Finally, Richard pointed toward the small conference room beside his office. You have as much time as you need. I closed the door behind me. The silence hit differently. Outside, I could hear muffled voices beginning to argue. Inside, only me, and my father's last words. My hands were shaking when I broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten page. No legal language, no formal greeting, just, Ethan. If you're reading this, then I've already run out of time. I swallowed hard. The company is not your inheritance? It's your burden. My heart skipped. What did that even mean? I kept reading. Someone close to this family has been stealing from me for years. I stopped. Stealing. That couldn't be right. Dad personally approved every financial report. Nobody understood business better than he did. Unless someone had fooled him anyway. I continued. I wanted to expose that person myself. I failed. A chill ran down my spine. Dad wasn't writing like a businessman. He was writing like someone who knew he was being hunted. Then came the sentence that changed everything. You cannot trust anyone in that room. I read it again and again. Not your brother, not Linda, not even Richard. Anyone. My pulse accelerated. Was grief making me misunderstand? Or had my father genuinely believed every person waiting outside was hiding something? The next paragraph only deepened the mystery. You always believed Daniel wanted my approval. That isn't what he's afraid of losing. What was that supposed to mean? I read faster. Linda married me for reasons she has never told you. That didn't surprise me. Every blended family had secrets. But the next line did. Richard knows more than he admits. I frowned. Richard Caldwell had practically lived with our family through every major legal decision for decades. If Dad no longer trusted him, who was left? Then I reached the bottom of the page. There was only one final instruction. Accept the inheritance. Then go to Cabin 7 at Blackstone Lake. Behind the fireplace is the truth. Tell no one where you're going. Nothing else. No explanation, no signature, only his initials. TC. I folded the letter carefully. Instead of feeling enlightened, I felt completely lost. When I opened the conference room door, the arguing stopped instantly. Every face turned toward me. Daniel searched my expression. What did he write? I slipped the letter into my jacket pocket. I'm not telling you. His eyes narrowed. So there really is a secret? I said I'm not telling you. Linda laughed nervously. Oh, this is unbelievable. Melissa looked uncomfortable. Ethan, maybe we should all calm down. Richard interrupted quietly. Have you made your decision? Every instinct told me to refuse. I didn't want a construction company. I didn't want millions of dollars. I certainly didn't want a family war. But my father's final sentence echoed inside my head. Accept the inheritance. I'll accept. The reaction was immediate. Daniel slammed his fist against the table. Damn it. His outburst startled everyone, even himself. For a split second, he looked embarrassed. Then the anger returned. You have no idea what you've just done. What does that mean? You'll find out. He grabbed his coat. We're leaving. As everyone prepared to go, Richard stopped me. Ethan. I waited until the others walked toward the elevator. Then he lowered his voice. Your father wasn't sleeping much these past few months? I looked at him carefully. He thought someone was following him? Did you believe him? Richard hesitated. I believed he believed it. Not the same answer, not even close. Was someone? I don't know. Another hesitation. Too small for most people to notice. Big enough for me. Richard was hiding something. Maybe not everything, but something. Outside, rain had begun falling. Daniel stood beside his SUV smoking a cigarette. He hadn't smoked since college. Another surprise. He noticed me watching. We need to talk. I'm listening. Not here? Then where? My office tomorrow morning. What about? The company. I don't know anything about running the company. You'll need to learn. His tone suddenly softened. For the first time all day, he sounded almost like my older brother again. Dad made a mistake. I don't think he did. You haven't even read the financial reports. My stomach tightened. What financial reports? He froze, only for a second, then smiled. The quarterly reports? Why would I read those? You own the company now. It sounded perfectly logical, yet something felt rehearsed, as though he'd almost said something else. Linda approached before I could ask another question. She removed her sunglasses. Her mascara had smeared from crying, or maybe from the rain. Ethan. What? There are things about your father. She stopped herself. What things? She looked toward Daniel, then back at me. Never mind. No. Finish. I shouldn't. Linda. Her eyes filled with tears, real ones this time. Not the carefully controlled tears she'd shown during the funeral. I loved your father. I know. No. She shook her head. You think I married him for money? I said nothing, because part of me still wondered. She smiled sadly. One day, you'll understand why I married him. Before I could respond, she climbed into her car and drove away, leaving me with another unanswered question. That night, I couldn't sleep. The letter lay open across my kitchen table. I read every sentence at least 20 times. Someone had been stealing. Someone couldn't be trusted. Cabin 7, Blackstone Lake, behind the fireplace. The entire thing sounded like the beginning of one of Dad's old detective novels, except this wasn't fiction. My father had written it only months before he died. Around midnight, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I answered, silence, then heavy breathing. Finally, a man's voice, low, calm, almost emotionless. Don't go to the cabin? My blood froze. Who is this? You'll die if you go. The line went dead. I immediately called back. The number didn't exist. I stared at my phone for nearly a minute. Then another notification appeared. Not a call, a text. There was no message, only a photograph. It showed my father's cabin at Blackstone Lake, taken that very night. Rain covered the windows. One upstairs light was glowing. But the cabin should have been empty, because after my father died, no one had the keys. Someone was already there, and whoever had sent the picture wanted me to know it. I left before sunrise. The rain had stopped, but the roads were still wet enough to reflect the gray Ohio sky like broken glass. Every mile toward Blackstone Lake felt heavier than the last. My father's words repeated in my head. Behind the fireplace is the truth. The anonymous warning hadn't scared me away. It convinced me I was heading in the right direction. Cabin 7 looked exactly as it had when I was a teenager. The weathered porch, the faded green shutters, the old oak tree Dad had refused to cut down because Mom loved watching birds nest there every spring. Everything was familiar, except one thing, fresh tire tracks. Someone had been there recently. I parked 100 yards away and approached on foot. The front door was unlocked. Immediately, something felt wrong. The fireplace was covered with soot, but the ashes inside were still warm. Someone had used it only hours earlier. The photograph hadn't lied. Someone had beaten me here. My heartbeat quickened as I knelt beside the fireplace. Dad had written, "Behind the fireplace." Running my hand along the old stonework, I noticed one brick sat slightly farther out than the others. I pressed it. A dull click echoed through the cabin. A hidden panel slowly opened beside the chimney. Inside sat a small fireproof lockbox. The key was already in it. Dad had expected me. Inside the box were 3 items: a leather-bound journal, a flash drive, and a sealed envelope labeled, "Read this only after watching the files." I inserted the flash drive into my laptop. Dozens of folders appeared. Bank statements, wire transfers, board meeting recordings, private emails. At first, nothing made sense. Then, I opened a spreadsheet. Hundreds of payments had been disguised as consulting fees over nearly 6 years. The money hadn't disappeared all at once. It had been siphoned away in tiny amounts. Never enough to attract attention. Together, more than $18 million. My father had been right. Someone had been stealing from him for years. Then I opened another folder. It contained security footage from the company's headquarters. The timestamp showed 2 months before Dad died. The office was empty until Daniel walked inside after midnight. He unlocked Dad's private filing cabinet, photographed documents, copied hard drives, then quietly locked everything again before leaving. I stared at the screen. No. There had to be an explanation. Daniel wasn't perfect. He could be arrogant, competitive, obsessed with proving himself, but he wasn't a thief, was he? A car door slammed outside. I looked through the window. Daniel. He'd followed me. He entered the cabin without knocking. "I knew you'd come here." "You tracked me?" I guessed. His eyes immediately found the open lockbox. His face turned white. "You opened it. You knew it existed?" It wasn't a question. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the laptop screen. Everything changed. He stopped pretending. "Ethan." I saw the transfers. Silence. I saw the surveillance video. His shoulders slowly dropped. I can explain. Please do. He closed his eyes, then whispered something I never expected. I never stole that money. I laughed bitterly. The evidence says otherwise. It was Dad. I froze. What? Dad ordered every transfer. No. He made me do it. I stepped backward. You're lying. I wish I were. Daniel sat down heavily. He knew the company was being targeted. By who? I never knew. He wouldn't tell me. He said someone wanted control of Carter Construction. He moved the money into hidden accounts to protect it. My head spun. So why hide it from me? Because he didn't trust anyone. Not even you. Daniel smiled sadly. I know. There was genuine pain in his voice, the kind that couldn't be faked. He spent years testing everyone. Employees, partners, family. He believed someone close to him had been bought. I remembered the letter. You cannot trust anyone. Maybe. He hadn't meant Daniel. Maybe he'd meant none of us knew who the real enemy was. The cabin door opened again. This time, it was Richard Caldwell, the lawyer. He looked exhausted. I hoped I'd arrive before either of you opened the box. You knew about this? I asked. I knew some of it. Daniel stood. You told him not to trust anyone. Richard nodded. Because Thomas ordered me to. No. He wanted Ethan to question everyone. Even you? Especially me. Richard slowly removed his glasses. If Ethan believed I was trustworthy, he'd never question anything I said. Every assumption I'd made was collapsing. Then Richard noticed the journal. You haven't read it yet. I picked it up. The final pages were dated only days before Dad died. His handwriting had become weaker. Today, I finally know who betrayed me. I turned the page. There was only one name, Linda. None of us spoke. Richard quietly nodded. She wasn't stealing money. Then what did she do? She was feeding confidential information to Victor Hale. The name meant nothing to me. Daniel answered first. Our biggest competitor, Richard nodded. Hale wanted to force your father into selling the company. He couldn't buy it honestly, so he tried to destroy it. The consulting payments, the hidden accounts. Dad hadn't been stealing. He'd been protecting the company's cash reserves before they could be frozen or manipulated. Everything suddenly fit, except one thing. If Linda betrayed him, why leave her the house and lifetime income? Richard smiled sadly. Read the envelope. I finally opened the sealed letter. Inside was my father's last message. If you've reached this point, then you've learned enough to understand why I made the choices I did. Linda betrayed my business. She never betrayed my heart. I frowned. Victor Hale discovered something from Linda's past. Her younger brother caused a fatal drunk driving accident years ago. Hale threatened to expose evidence proving her brother fled the country under a false identity unless she cooperated. Daniel whispered she was being blackmailed. The next sentence hit even harder. She confessed everything to me 6 weeks before I died. She begged me to hate her. I couldn't. I closed my eyes. Dad had known. He'd forgiven her. Not because what she'd done was acceptable, because he understood why she'd done it. The inheritance wasn't revenge. It was mercy. 3 days later, federal investigators arrested Victor Hale using the evidence hidden in the cabin. The stolen accounts were recovered. Every dollar returned to the company. Linda publicly admitted her role. She accepted responsibility without asking for forgiveness. Daniel resigned as CEO for 6 months while independent auditors reviewed every transaction, even though he was eventually cleared of wrongdoing. When the investigation ended, I surprised everyone, including myself. I refused to become CEO. Instead, I appointed Daniel to lead the company permanently. This time, not because Dad wanted him to, because I did. For the first time in years, we weren't competing for our father's approval. We were honoring his final lesson together. A month later, Daniel and I stood beside our parents' graves. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he asked, "Do you think Dad planned all this?" I looked at the fresh flowers resting between Mom's and Dad's headstones. I don't think he planned everything. What do you mean? I think he hoped we'd finally stop fighting each other long enough to see who the real enemy was. Daniel smiled. So the company was never the inheritance. I shook my head. No, it was trust. And after spending our entire lives trying to earn our father's respect, we finally understood the gift he'd actually left behind. Not wealth, not power, a second chance to become brothers again. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, property, or power. It's the truth that forces a family to confront its failures, forgive impossible mistakes, and rebuild the trust that pride nearly destroyed. If you were in Ethan's place, would you have forgiven Linda after learning she betrayed the family under blackmail? Or would some actions remain unforgivable no matter the reason? Share your thoughts in the comments below.